has her power.
This is only the beginning.
Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be my Dune breakdown video, Easter eggs. I'll talk about the ending and what's going on with the franchise because obviously this is just part one. The movie itself felt like an amazing first half of a season of television. It would be really weird if they did not do part two and give us the rest of the story. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the videos. And big spoiler warning for everything that happens during Dune Part 1. So you've all seen a version of Dune or you've read the books. But as you saw from this movie, there are a lot of differences between this, the original movie, the Dune miniseries, and even a few minor changes from the books. But this movie, like Dune Part 1 in 2021, is trying to be much more accurate to the books than previous iterations. The Dune miniseries from the early 2000s also did try to be very accurate to the books, which is why it was much, much longer. And that's also the reason why they decided to break the story of the first book into two different movies, why they say Dune Part 1 at the beginning of this film. But one of the first big changes, one of the first big Easter eggs and references is at the beginning of the movie, instead of doing the thing that the last couple of movies, the miniseries, have done, opening with the narration from the books, they opted instead to open with the Sardaukar speaking about dreams. That special type of throat speaking was a Sardaukar speaking that message. Dreams are messages from the deep. The way they use that phrase, it means two different things. Dreams are Paul's visions, and the deep, as in the deep desert, the worms, the spice, is just foreshadowing what's going to be happening during part one, him getting visions. But it's also about Paul's ability to see the future and also remember everything from the past through genetic memory as part of his powers. So not only can he see potential futures, he can also remember everything that's ever happened. So when the Sardaukar is saying dreams are messages from the deep, he's talking about deep as in the deep past, like the distant past. He's getting messages from the past. And the phrase, dreams are messages from the deep, is meant to be a metaphor for the entire Dune series, not just for what's happening in this first movie. The idea that Paul's going to be influenced by the past, and it will affect the way that he uses his powers to lead humanity to this better future that Reverend Mother Mohiam talked about. So dreams as messages from the deep is kind of meant to be a warning and a prophecy at the same time for the entire Dune series. Like in future movies, hopefully they wind up making them Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune. Messages from the Deep takes a more sinister connotation with other characters too. So that's why I say it's a metaphor for the entire series, not just for the stuff that's happening in Dune Part 1. If you're a longtime fan of the book series, you probably noticed a lot of the production design language tried to be much more accurate to original concept art. Hans Zimmer did the music and the soundtrack was amazing, but the way they use different sounds, like the sound design of the movie and the way they use that to tell the story, is also incredible. The way they end things here is they end just as Paul is getting ready to join the Fremen and start to learn more of their customs, become one of them, and then help train them to become the most fearsome fighting force in the universe, teaching them the Bene Gesserit fighting ways that he knows, as well as teaching them the secret House Atreides fighting methods that makes them so fearsome to the other forces like the Harkonnens. Like they talk about the Atreides being one of the most fearsome fighting forces in the universe, but then the Sardaukar are like, hold my beer. The idea being that when Paul trains them in the Bene Gesserit fighting techniques and the House Atreides fighting techniques, it makes the Fremen even better fighters than the Sardaukar. But as you can see during some of the big fights they have towards the end of the film, once the Sardaukar legions roll in, even without the extra fight training, the Fremen are still very fearsome and able to kill most of the Sardaukar, but not all of them. There's also a really cool parallel between the Sardaukar and the Fremen too, because the Sardaukar are also a pseudo-religious army of zealots training in a similarly harsh environment of Seleucus Secundus. Even though we only visit there briefly during the movie, they want to show you that it's an incredibly harsh climate, but in stark contrast to the desert, it's raining all the time. But Seleucus Secundus is basically the Emperor's prison planet. All these Sardaukar that you see strung up, they're trained like this starting around the age, I think, of like 6 or 7, and most of the people that enter training wind up dying before the age of 11 or 12. Their training is so hardcore that the ones that do survive to adulthood, like these legions here, are the most fearsome fighters in the universe, at least until Paul winds up training the Fremen even more. I feel like this movie did a much better job of hyping that up and getting that idea across than the original Dune movie or even the miniseries. But what happens at the end here is that Jessica is able to one-up Stilgar, and even though he's ready to give them sanctuary within their siege, Jamis calls Jessica out, and Paul has to fight for her as her champion. The knife that he's fighting Jamis with is a Chris knife. You see a couple of them throughout the movie. They're knives that are fashioned from the teeth of the sandworms. That's why they call it the Tooth of Shai-Hulud, the Great Worm. And the really cool thing that they did here using Paul's abilities is that Jameis winds up being the person in Paul's recent visions that he just had, teaching him lessons about the desert, guiding him, mentoring him, even though Paul winds up being forced to kill him in the fight, per the Fremen's customs. So a lot of you ask, how did Paul learn lessons through his visions, through his dreams of the future from Jameis if Jameis died here in this fight? There is no actual time travel in the Dune universe, like nobody physically travels backwards in time or forwards in time. Paul's powers passed down to him through his bloodline orchestrated by the Bene Gesserit give him a measure of prescience. When he's been dreaming, as Reverend Mother Mohiam explained to him, he's been dreaming versions of the future. But here's the thing, Paul can't predict the future perfectly. He told Mohiam that not all the things that he dreams wind up happening exactly as he dreamed them. That's why she gets so pissed off with him and tells him, I hope you live, human, because your abilities have barely begun to awaken. If you remember the original movie, that also plays into that scene of the sleeper awakening, Paul awakening his full powers. But at this point in the movie, that hasn't happened yet. So what's happening here right before Paul's fight with Jameis is that he's seeing a bunch of potential futures based on actions that he's thinking about taking. Even though they only show you some of his visions, it's implied that he has other visions all the time as well. So him having a vision of future Jameis, teaching him the ways of the Fremen, was one of the potential outcomes for this had he and Jessica acted differently during this encounter with Stilgar and the other Fremen. So it's implied that in the timeline where Jameis was alive to teach him, Jameis had not challenged Jessica or Paul to fight, but he did, obviously, so the future changed and Paul was forced to kill him. But Paul was able to benefit from the knowledge that he learned in that potential timeline using his powers. They'll continue to play with this really cool concept in the Dune sequels, Paul viewing multiple potential futures and having to deal with the problems that comes with that ability. Because if the outcomes of a bunch of different timelines are similar, how would you choose which path to take? Which future would you pursue? It's a lot like Doctor Strange during Avengers Infinity War with the Time Stone. He uses it to view 14 million different possible timelines to find one where they're able to beat Thanos for good and finds one. So that's the path they take. Side note too, for all the Marvel fans out there, yes, Josh Brolin is playing Gurney Halleck during the movie The War Master of House Atreides. He was Thanos in the Marvel Universe. But the thing with Paul Atreides is that as a potential Kwisatz Haderach, his one job, as ordained by this whole Bene Gesserit breeding program, is to lead all of humanity on the Golden Path. The Golden Path is what the Bene Gesserit call their concept of a perfect timeline, like what is the best timeline for humanity, and they call that the Golden Path. So over thousands of years, they try to create this super being through a breeding program that can see that perfect timeline and tell everyone how to bring about those events. Within the Dune series, the term Kwisatz Haderach literally translates to shortening of the way, as in finding a quicker way to a better future. So that's why they were trying to create this super being. I don't want to talk too much about the story beyond Dune Part 2, because even though Paul does wind up drinking the Water of Life to fully awaken his powers, like we see during the original Dune movie, the Water of Life being the bile of the sandworms, and it does amplify his powers exponentially. But Dune Part 2, if you haven't read that first book or you never watched the original movie, is still very much focused on the immediate problem, the war between Paul, the Fremen, the Harkonnens, and the Emperor. Everything with Paul trying to reckon with the Golden Path timeline doesn't really become a huge deal until the next story after that, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, and for the most part is actually Paul's son, Leto Atreides II, who has to reckon with the Golden Path. And during the ending of Dune Part 1, during this first movie, they kind of foreshadow this. Paul can see a version of the Golden Path, this future that the Bene Gesserit are looking for. But during this scene, when they're in the tent, Paul starts having this nightmare ranting about wars being fought under his banner, atrocities being committed in his name, all over the universe, people being slaughtered everywhere by his followers. And it frightens him. He's horrified by it. So in those visions, what he's seeing is one of the possible iterations of the Golden Path timeline. So he actually becomes too afraid to pursue the Golden Path himself. He kind of runs from it because he can't stand the thought of all this death and destruction being done in his name. Like, this doesn't sound better, this is worse. If you've ever heard anybody refer to the Dune story as a warning for the savior trope, that's what they're talking about. And they really won't get into that till the sequels, I think, till after Dune Part 2. Like if they make Dune Part 4, Part 5, they do God Emperor of Dune. So that's why I say his son, Leto Atreides II, really has to deal with pursuing the Golden Path, and why Paul isn't really the Kwisatz Haderach that everyone thinks he is during the Dune movie or even Dune Part 2. It's really his son who's the true Kwisatz Haderach. There's an Easter egg for that at the beginning of Dune Part 1, when Mohiam is coming to give him the test and Jessica kind of explains the whole concept of their breeding program. They say that we believe this person that we're trying to create is very near. It's meant to be a bit of a misdirect because Paul is standing very near, like, oh, he's meant to be this powerful person, but really it winds up being his son to be this perfect being that they thought they were creating. But here's the thing, Mohiam says that they have other irons in the fire, like if Paul winds up dying, we have other candidates, other prospects out there in the universe. So there are many other people who can have the same type of powers to see potential futures and have knowledge of the past, but in most of these other people, the powers are much more limited. Paul's sister, for instance, who's still a fetus inside Jessica's womb right now at the end of Dune Part 1, also gains the same kind of powers when Jessica takes the water of life. They cover some of this during the original Dune movie, which was a very different version of the Dune book story and kind of a speed run version of that first book. But talking about some of the other characters, about Jason Momoa's Duncan Idaho, some of you obviously know him as Aquaman in the DC movies or as Khal Drogo in the Game of Thrones universe. Without letting the director know, he actually worked in a sly Game of Thrones Easter egg for one of these big fight scenes. When the Harkonnens and the Sardaukar are assaulting House Atreides before he's taken off in the ship, when they filmed this scene, Jason Momoa had just watched the Game of Thrones Season 8 finale, and because he played Khal Drogo during Season 1, and because of his character's relationship with Daenerys and his real-life friendship with Emilia Clarke, while they were filming, he dedicated his fight to his Khaleesi. Like, he literally shouts it out, "That fight's for you, Khaleesi."
I just saw the season finale of Game of Thrones last night. This fight's for you, Khaleesi.
But the other cool thing here, you may have realized, Duncan winds up dying during the events of the film trying to fight the Sardaukar. And like I said, Sardaukar at this point in the story are still the most fearsome fighting force in the universe. So the fact that Duncan is able to go so long against them and kill so many of them just shows you how badass he is. But Jason Momoa is not permadead. He did die here. This body is dead. But in the Dune universe, there's this cool form of cloning called Gholas. So Gholas are clones created from the cells of a person who has died. And even though within the Dune story it happens all over the universe all the time, the practice is kind of frowned upon. But when someone creates a Ghola, they give it all the memories of the original person using genetic memory and a form of conditioning. So creating a Ghola clone is like creating a semi-perfect backup of a person. But Ghola Duncan doesn't really become a huge character until God Emperor of Dune, I believe, so it's going to be a while before we see him come back. And what's happening here as they're walking out into the desert with Chani and the rest of the Fremen is they're getting ready to climb on one of the backs of the worms and ride it to the next siege. In this scene of him staring at her like she says this is only the beginning, and you sort of get this close-up on her face, is meant to be a reference back to the visions that he was having of her at the beginning of the movie. This moment in the future came to pass exactly as it did during his dream. It just, at the time, he didn't understand what it meant, and now he does understand. In fact, a lot of the scenes of Chani at the beginning of the movie where he's dreaming her these attacks on the Harkonnen ships, that's stuff that's going to be happening in the later movies. Like you see him dreaming himself in the armor fighting the Harkonnen troops. So even at the beginning of Part 1, they're already showing you scenes that are going to be happening during Part 2. But like I said, the next big thing that's going to be happening is Paul learning the ways of the Fremen, becoming one of them, starting his relationship with Chani, then helping teach the Bene Gesserit, the House Atreides secret fighting techniques to the Fremen to make them even more powerful than the Sardaukar. Then Paul orchestrating his original plan that he had before everything went down to cease all this hostility in the universe between the Harkonnens, the Emperor, by marrying the Emperor's daughter, Princess Irulan. We haven't met her yet, so I'm assuming they'll introduce her in Part 2, also introducing Feyd Harkonnen, because he's a pretty big character, but they don't feature him anywhere during Part 1. Feyd is the Baron's other nephew and Raban's, the Beast's, younger brother. I don't know who they've cast to play that character, but they'll probably announce it once they announce the sequel. The thing about Feyd is that the Baron actually views him as his true successor, since the Baron himself doesn't have any children of his own that he recognizes at this point in the story. Feyd and Raban are the children of the Baron's brother, who I believe was actually ahead of him in the line of succession, but then abdicated his position, so the Baron wound up inheriting his family's title. I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, but we'll also learn in Part 2 about how the Bene Gesserit manipulated the Baron when he was younger in service of their breeding program. Because the Baron does have children and grandchildren now, it's just that he doesn't know about them. Also really cool detail too that they don't get into in Part 1, but you see the Baron there, he looks kind of like this floating mass of flesh, like what happened to him? Because he actually used to look kind of like Feyd when he was younger. He used to be this very beautiful looking man. The reason why he looks like this, why his body just degenerated into this lump of flesh, is because of something that Reverend Mother Mohayim did to him when he was younger as a form of revenge. It is all part of this grand breeding program of theirs, so we'll talk more about that when they drop a trailer for Dune Part 2. Hopefully they'll announce that movie and we'll wind up seeing it within the next couple of years, but it's going to be a while, obviously, before they start making it. But if you have any big questions about the story or any big twists or what's going on, just write them below in the comments and I'll try to answer them in the comments. Marvel is releasing the Eternals movie really soon, so I'll be doing a bunch of videos for that. Make sure you have alerts enabled so you don't miss anything. Everyone click here for my new Eternals Doctor Strange trailer video and Easter eggs, and click here for my new Spider-Man No Way Home trailer video and Easter eggs. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.